It's July 10th, 1925, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retro Spectators.
The Scopes monkey trial story you might have heard starts today in history in 1925, and it goes like this. High school science teacher John T. Scopes was put on trial for teaching evolution in conservative Tennessee, a martyr for his beliefs. But the truth was that this was a show trial. John Scopes wasn't a science teacher, and he probably hadn't actually ever taught evolution. Oh, and there were no monkeys.
And show trial is absolutely right, because this really put evolutionists against fundamentalists in what was a very tiny courthouse. And when the trial began, it attracted crowds of spectators and journalists from all over the world. And along Dayton's main street, you had preachers who had erected revival tents. And Dayton itself turned into this total carnival atmosphere with an exhibition that showcased two chimpanzees and vendors peddling Bibles.
I was going to say, there were monkeys there. Are chimpanzees monkeys? Yeah.
It's exactly. Yeah, you even had toy monkeys, hot dogs and lemonade, and, just this sort of absolute circus atmosphere.
But if you're thinking, well, actually, this whole idea of putting evolution on trial is in itself something that seems familiar from listening to this show, that's because we had our own version of this in the UK, in Oxford, in 1860. But this is 1925. This is 60 years later. I mean, it is such an embarrassment for the southern states and for the Bible Belt that this was happening in a court. Of course, it's hard to prove, are we descended from monkeys, but it's not really the place to have that debate. And it's centred around whether children should be exposed to the ideas of science or just the ideas of fundamentalist Christianity.
Yeah, so what had happened in 1925 was that Tennessee had passed what's called the Butler Act. It was a state law, and it made the teaching of evolution in public schools a criminal offence, and also made it specifically an offence to teach anything that contradicted the biblical account of creation. Now, for the American Civil Liberties Union, which had been founded only 5 years earlier, this looked like a perfect test case. So they offered to pay the legal fees of any Tennessee teacher willing to violate the act to test its constitutionality. And there was a businessman in Dayton, Tennessee, called George Rapouillet, and he was the manager of a coal and iron company. He read about this offer in a newspaper. He was pro-evolution himself, but he thought a juicy show trial would get Dayton publicity. And the crux of the case rested on the fact that a state-approved science textbook used in Tennessee included a chapter on evolution, which left teachers in a bind. Did they skip it, or could they teach out of it because the textbook had been approved by the state, even though it now was against the law? So they needed to find a teacher to become the test case. So they settled on a guy called John Scopes. He was 25 years old. He worked at Ray County High School. But interestingly, as I mentioned up top, he wasn't a science teacher just sacrificing himself for his subject. His main role at the school was football coach. And like many football coaches in American schools over the years, he also filled in as what we would call a supply teacher, substitute teacher in the US, in a variety of subjects, including science. And they were like, have you taught evolution? He was like, I'm not sure. I've taught a lot of stuff.
Have you opened this textbook in front of some children?
Have you ever seen this textbook?
And sure enough, he was then arrested. He didn't spend any time behind bars or even in a cell because he was immediately bailed. And immediately, as soon as it came into the headlines, both sides, both the prosecution and defense, began seriously lawyering up. Because, first of all, hearing of this coordinated attack on Christian fundamentalism, a guy called William Jennings Bryan, a 3-time Democratic presidential candidate and a total fundamentalist hero, he volunteered to assist the prosecution. And then author H.G. Wells was approached early on to present the case for evolution, but he turned down the offer. And that's how Clarence Darrow, the attorney who is famous for taking on controversial cases, he found out about the Scopes trial through the journalist H.L. Mencken, who suggested him, and Darrow initially declined since he was preparing to retire. But the news of Bryan's involvement caused him to get back involved because he had a history sparring with this fundamentalist Bryan. And so he was like, well, I'm just going to get involved. And this was the first and only time in his career that he offered to give free legal aid.
Except it's worth saying, when you talk about them sparring together and having a history of confrontation, yes, but always in this very Southern gentlemanly type way. I mean, actually, they're mates. Right? They're having an intellectual debate. And in fact, Darrow had previously spoken in favour of Bryan's presidential campaign because, as you said, actually, ultimately he was a Democrat. It's just that he'd been on an anti-evolution crusade since 1905. I mean, here's a quote from him from 20 years earlier. The Darwinian theory represents man reaching his present perfection by the operation of the law of hate. this merciless law by which the strong crowd out and kill off the weak. That was his objection, was that it was hateful rather than the love that you read in the Bible.
Yeah, and Bryan has sometimes been portrayed as just kind of tedious, old-fashioned, conservative windbag, not least because that's kind of how he comes off in the movie they made based on this in the 1960s. But he had actually been heavily involved in progressive activism most of his career for workers' rights, for women's suffrage. But in the 1920s, he'd become increasingly religious and started focusing pretty much all his energy on the movement to keep evolution out of schools. But despite being portrayed as kind of a head-to-head between Darrow and Bryan, both men were essentially celebrity guests.
Yes.
The defence was actually headed by a local law professor, John Arneill Jr., the prosecution by the district attorney, Tom Stewart. So people were coming to town to see these famous orators sparring, but they weren't really leading the case at all. And that's kind of how a lot of what was discussed in the court started to become really far out of the purview of, did John Scopes teach evolution out of this textbook? Which was good, because actually, when a grand jury was held to decide whether to indict Scopes, they heard testimony from his students who had to be coached beforehand to say, yes, Mr. Scopes taught us evolution out of the science textbook, because they couldn't remember him teaching it either. I mean, this was actually just a big splashy chance to debate evolution.
Judge John T. Ralston relocated the trial proceedings to the courthouse lawn due to the concerns that he had about the sheer volume of people who were inside, which posed a risk, he said, of collapsing the floor. So on top of it being this carnival atmosphere and the madness outside the court, it then descended yet further into that madness by literally going outside into the world, and that's where it started to be held.
And Darrow actually had gone there to argue with Bryan, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. So he thought, I'm going to call Bryan as a witness. I mean, this was his kind of genius move that students of the law have always focused on. I mean, I must say, he comes across as a bit of a wanker to me, Clarence Darrow. I know he's a great liberal hero. But I mean, you read what he then did with Bryan, who literally then becomes kind of defender of the faith. So he's like, Bryan, if you really believe this, let me cross-examine you about the Bible. And then it's all like, Mr. Bryan, do you believe the first woman was Eve? Do you really believe she was made out of Adam's rib? And it's a bit tedious reading. It's like, okay, we get the point. But that went on for many hours, and the judge allowed it to go on, even though it was clearly completely a side issue to whether or not a teacher that no one had ever heard of had taught this textbook that no one had ever heard of.
In fact, Judge Ralston eventually expunged the whole exchange and said, it has no impact on the question of what happened in this particular classroom. But it did produce great moments. Darrow quizzing Bryan on the lawn of the courthouse in mid-July. Everyone's in their sort of white southern summer suits. It made for great photos. And you also had great dispatches being sent. This trial was being followed all around the country. As you mentioned, H.L. Mencken, one of the most famous journalists of the day, was there in person. He was very sharp-tongued, very cynical, and he was known for his portrayals of America as what he called a society of jackals preying on jackasses. He was also an outspoken atheist, and his widely syndicated dispatches for the Baltimore Sun helped shape the way the trial was being seen and remembered across the country. He coined the name, the Scopes Monkey Trial, and it was part of an overall attitude of mockery for the fundamentalists. He called Bryan a buffoon. He portrayed the locals as, quote, yokels, and, quote, I love this, hot for Genesis.
Everyone turned up to talk. No one was disputing what had been done. They were there to almost dispute the law itself. And that's why, finally, on July the 21st, during his closing statement, Darrow took this really radical approach of urging the jury to deliver a guilty verdict. His hope was so as to facilitate an appeal. And he then closed the case for the defense without a final summation. And under Tennessee law, the defense waiving its right to a closing speech meant that the prosecution was also barred from summing up its case, and that stopped Bryan from being able to do the grandstanding thing that he had in mind, and meant that kind of Darrow's final thoughts were the final thoughts.
Yeah, it was a very uncinematic ending to the case, because not only did they end up fining Scopes a pretty unremarkable $100, it only took the jury 9 minutes to return the verdict.
Yeah, because he had taught the textbook. He said he had.
Yeah, exactly. And then it continued to be overwhelming, because the verdict ultimately did get overturned on appeal, but not because of Darrow's dazzling legal fireworks or judges suddenly coming to the realization that evolution was the way forward. Instead, it was a legal technicality about the way the fine was handed down. The fine was handed down by the judge judge, but under the law, technically it should have been handed down via the jury. So he didn't have to pay the $100, but it was hardly a climactic end to the case.
Bryan, after the case, died in his sleep in Dayton the following Sunday after the trial finished. And historians have long disagreed about whether the trial was connected to Bryan's death, but certainly you can see how the stress of what he had gone through and the...
Being publicly humiliated.
Yeah.
Even if he believed what he was saying, everyone was pointing at him and jeering.
As for Scopes himself, this kind of reminds me a little bit of the Rosa Parks incident. Like Parks, Scopes was sort of abandoned a little bit by the movement afterwards. He found the media attention really overwhelming at the time, but after the trial was over, he ultimately quit teaching. He went into the oil business in Texas and Louisiana, and he did write a memoir in 1967, which was the same year the Butler Act was repealed.
Meanwhile, this is the thing that Dayton, Tennessee is still famous for in the States, and you can go there every summer to watch the case being reenacted.
Bring your own chimpanzee kind of a situation.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at Club Retrospectors. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.